அனைவருக்கும் வணக்கம். இன்று நீங்கள் MLOps கம்யூனிட்டி பாட்காஸ்ட் கேட்கிறீர்கள். இது உலகத்தின் மிகச்சிறந்த பாட்காஸ்ட் ஆகும். என் பெயர் கிருஷ்ணாராம். நான் Fiddler Labs சீஃப் சயின்டிஸ்டாக பணிபுரிகிறேன். இன்று நாம் அனைவரும் ரெஸ்பான்சிபிள் ஆர்டிஃபிஷியல் இன்டெலிஜென்ஸ், அதாவது பொறுப்பான செயற்கை நுண்ணறிவு பற்றி பேச போகிறோம்.
You're kind of a celebrity these days, and I've decided to bring you on to guest host. You skipped over. Normally it's like people, they will come on the podcast and then they have a lot of great things to say. So we try and get them on to guest host. You just skipped over coming on the podcast and went right to guest host.
I'm just fashionably late. I'm just trying to be fashionably late to the party.
Well, you're doing a great job. So for those of you that do not know, Mihail Eric, he is our guest host of honor today. I feel like your names are reversed, by the way.
You're the first person that's ever said that.
Yeah.
Nice.
Oh, man. I fell into that trap, didn't I? So anyway, you are not the guest of honor, though. Today we talked with Krishnaram Kenthapadi, and you probably heard him speaking just a few moments ago. So hopefully your Tamil is on point and you understood exactly what he said. If you didn't, I will translate it for you. He said the MLOps community podcast is the best podcast in the world. And we're going to be talking about responsible AI today. Quick intro about Krishnaram, because, man, this guy's got a bio that's like 3 pages long. He's worked at places like Microsoft. He's on boards that are a bunch of letters and capitals that I can't even pronounce practically. He's got so many awards. It's outrageous, like NAACL, WWW, SODA, CIKM. This guy's kind of a legend. And he's worked at LinkedIn. He's worked at your alma mater, AWS. He has also worked at Microsoft. I think I said that. I mean, the dude's been in the game since 2006 and it shines through. So what kind of takeaways did you have?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it was really great to bring him on because he really has spearheaded a lot of the initiatives around explainable and responsible AI over the last few years. I mean, it's so many organizations, and I think it's fantastic that folks such as him are being so proactive about putting these ideas in people's heads and encouraging that kind of education in the community. I think that a lot of the things that you talked about, I think, are super important. Right now, we're entering this phase of machine learning and MLOps where there's a lot of people deploying and a lot of organizations deploying models into production. And that obviously promises a lot of benefits, but also it's one of those with great power comes great responsibility. And I think that that's something that organizations are just now starting to think about. How can we be responsible about the AI that we put out into the world? What kind of questions should we be asking to really ensure that we're putting the best versions of the models out there that are equitable and fair to as many people as possible? And also, how can we bring all stakeholders in an organization to the table to actually think about these questions as a unit instead of just the ML practitioners building models off in a corner? So I think he really shined a very big light on a lot of those questions.
Dude, he rattled off a list of questions you can be asking yourself. Just like off the top of his head, he had probably like 20 or 30 questions that are like, oh, that's a great question to ask. Oh, yeah, you should definitely do that. And if somebody is proactive about this, I think it would be the easiest thing to take all those questions that he rattled off, make them into a checklist, and start asking yourself that. That is so easy to do. Just grab that, make it into a checklist, figure it out. There were so many gems here. I don't want to spoil it for anybody, so we're going to get right into the conversation. Last thing I will say before we jump into the conversation, if you're listening to this on Apple Podcast or Spotify, all these good places, YouTube, give us a like, give us some ratings, give us a comment or a review. All that helps us tremendously, and it would be a great honor to hear from you.
Especially if you give us 5 stars. Yeah. And it pays our bills.
It doesn't pay your bills, man. This is your first time on here.
I'm just trying to promote the podcast, all right?
I love it. You're a natural. All right, let's get into this conversation. Oh, yeah, by the way, This episode is sponsored by Fiddler AI. If you are looking for explainability tools or model monitoring tools, then check them out. You can find a link to all of their goodness in the description. And without further ado, now we're really getting into the conversation. So, man, I know that you're working with a ton of customers and you're principally looking at explainable AI. And so I'm wondering, what are some of the main issues that people struggle with when it comes to explainable AI?
Hi, Demetrius. Yeah, first of all, thanks for inviting me to this podcast. As I mentioned, we are working on helping customers understand how their models behave, both before deploying the models and also once the models are deployed. So, for before deploying the models, often the focus is on model validation and explainable AI. But once the models are deployed, the customers are expressing a lot of interest in monitoring models. Are they behaving as intended? Is there drift in the input distribution? Are there changes in the relationship between the target variable and the input features? So these are some of the things that customers care a lot about.
Makes complete sense. And I like that. Now, as you are thinking about explainable AI, I know that I've talked to the other Krishna from Fiddler before, and we also spoke with Amit, and he mentioned that there are certain models and certain architectures and the way that you set things up that can be more difficult when it comes to explainability. Have you thought about how to attack that problem?
Yeah, yes, this is a challenge that we often hear from customers. If you look at how machine learning has evolved over several years, initially it started with perhaps even before machine learning, rule-based models, right? Simple models that everyone could understand. The model developer themselves could understand, and now from there we have moved to more complex models, whether it is deep learning models with several layers, or even linear models with a large number of parameters. So then the challenge is that even the person who developed the model or trained the model is not in a position to understand how the model works. So I would like to draw a subtle distinction here. We all understand the methods used to train the model. For example, if you think of deep learning models, the algorithm called stochastic gradient descent is very simple to state and very easy to understand. But the challenge is the output of that algorithm, which is the deep learning model, is something that for humans it becomes very hard to understand. I think that's the challenge that we are facing. Yeah, we are facing this dilemma between having models which are sufficiently complex, and as a result they are performing very well. They are surpassing human performance on many cognition and related tasks. At the same time, we as humans are having trouble understanding how these models are behaving. So that's where explainable AI is stepping in and helping us resolve this dilemma.
Mihail, I know you got something, man. I
Yeah.
see you there. Jump in.
Yeah. Happy to jump in. So it seems that what you're suggesting, Krishna, is that maybe nowadays, given that there's been an increase in the number of deep learning models, that the role of explainable AI has become even more prominent or more important in organizations today.
Yeah, yes, that's right. So this is one way I often tend to think of this. If we rewind back maybe 10 or 15 years, right, security was often thought of as an afterthought. Say companies would focus on, say, models or business metrics, business goals. But security was thought of as, well, this is something that's not as important. But once we started seeing lots of breaches, right, data breaches and other types of breaches, companies realize that security is very important. So I see a similar parallel happening today in if you take machine learning or broadly AI systems. If you look at explainability or model monitoring, in the past, there was a mindset that let's collect training data, let's train models, and then we are done. But there is now a realization that that's not enough. It's not enough to just vet the models before they're deployed, but it's also equally important to keep monitoring the models once they're deployed, because of some of the reasons we discussed earlier.
Right. That makes sense.
There's something. There's something funny because I remember, just the quick interjection here. When I was working at my first job in tech, I was working for this security company, and it was actually a password management company. And I just remember how we used to love it when there would be these huge security breaches, because it was like, yes, that just proves the point that we're trying to make on how important password manager is, or like actual security is. How much do you guys eat it up when there is something that goes wrong, like the AI? You hear about the headlines of like, oh, this happened at XYZ company and they can't explain anything, or they were able to. It's a huge blunder for the machine learning world. I imagine that's got to be one of those moments where you're like, ooh, this is bad, but it's kind of good.
Yeah, yes, I kind of resonate a lot with your sentiment. That, like, in the sense that when, say, let's say researchers, especially academic researchers, find out about problems with various commercial APIs or other kinds of models, um, for the organization or company which is providing those models, or even as perhaps many of the listeners of this podcast, as the MLOps engineers or scientists, that may not be the most comfortable situation to be in, right? But if you take a step back and view as a larger society or larger machine learning community, I think that's in the right direction. We need checks and balances. We need somebody to be probing our models, right? Somebody to be having auditing our models. And often when I talk to customers, I emphasize that it's best in the customer's interest to not wait for some regulation to take place, or some law, or some academic researchers to find out issues about the models. It's in the best self-interest of any company to thoroughly vet their models for various types of biases and other issues before, say, that's discovered by outside world. If you are interested, I can give some even practical examples of how this is happening today.
Yes, please.
So if we go back about, say, 3 or 4 years back, we started seeing lots of instances where researchers were able to find issues with online services, ranging from, say, issues with Google image search, right? Where if you query for, say, terms like CEOs, you are getting predominantly images from one demographic group. Or if you look at autocomplete, if you say, say, um, if you say something like Caucasian uh, boys, or if you say haircut, you will see largely, say, haircuts of maybe Caucasian or light-skinned haircuts, and you may not see as many of say haircuts of African Americans, or in general like dark-skinned haircuts. Or if you and a few years later, researchers were able to discover issues with uh, the facial analysis APIs, and notice that these APIs perform really well for those who are male and light skinned, as compared to those who are female and darker skinned. Uh, so we may think that this is easier because these APIs are available, right? But if you look at what happened with the Apple credit card debacle, it's that even in cases where it's not an online API, if somebody is really determined, they can, say, apply for credit cards, say a husband and wife with identical credit scores and characteristics, applied for the same credit card, and notice that the credit limits they got, or the denial and approval, were very different. So even in cases where the companies may think that their models are not easily visible, if somebody is really determined, they can discover issues. So that's why I'm emphasizing that it's in the best interest of organizations to kind of vet their models or AI systems beforehand, and not just once, but it's good to keep doing that constantly, right? Keep monitoring the models even after they are in production.
So one maybe related point to this, because I think this brings up a very interesting idea, which is that explainable AI is this movement that is becoming increasingly big nowadays, right? I wonder what the role of education is in explainable AI systems. Namely, how often is it the case that, Fiddler being a group that's very active in hosting webinars and being present in conferences, where you guys go out and educate the community about the importance of explainable AI. How often is it the case that you have to, spend that time to inform people about these things rather than people coming to you with their burning problems that they need you to resolve?
So that's a great point. I think we are in this domain, right? If you look at MLOps broadly or explainable AI, we are in this domain which is rapidly evolving, both in industry and also in academia. So that means that there is a strong need to create awareness amongst our potential customers. Um, so we are both addressing problems that customers are asking us upfront, and also we are working on problems that we expect customers will ask us, say, a year down the road or 2 years down the road. I think that's where creating awareness and education becomes very important. So just to give even examples, Fiddler has been conducting the Explainable AI summits for the last 3 years. I was there during the very first summit in a small conference room, and there were probably about 40 attendees, and I was one of the panelists as a technical advisor to Fiddler back then. And from there, if you look at the summit that we held last fall, it was attended by several hundreds of attendees. So that just shows the increasing interest in this field. So likewise, we're also seeing a difference when we talk to customers. Yeah, say a year or 2 years back, when we talk to customers about need for model performance management, need for ML monitoring, often we may hear, why should we care? Right? That was the sentiment. But now we are seeing a change. The customers have realized that these are important problems, not only from the perspective of social responsibility or regulations, but it also ties in directly with their business metrics or their bottom line. So we are seeing that customers are coming to us with this, realizing that these are important problems to be addressed.
Got it. So it's a little bit of both. It's both proactive education as well as the fact that people are coming to realizations about the importance of these problems, and sort of there's a nice hybrid in the middle, it sounds.
And kind of to relate to that, there's often in organizations we see this difference, right? Like if you look at the leadership in the organizations, like say CXOs or VPs and so on, they have often bought into this notion that explainability is important, or kind of AI governance, model management are important. But we want to get to a stage where everyone at the organization, right, like machine learning engineers, data scientists, they all realize that these are important things. It should not be something coming top down. Instead, it should be like everyone should be wanting to make sure that the models they train, the models they deploy, meet our ethical values, our societal values. I think that's where we need to get towards. And it's often, it's not only, I think it's not just organizations like Fiddler or the MLOps community. I think there is a broader role. Even in academia, there is a lot of emphasis on having classes on AI ethics as part of, say, computer science curriculum, undergraduate or master's or PhD curriculums. I think there is a realization that computer science is not just remaining a pure technical discipline, as computer science and say machine learning or AI is having more and more impact on the society. We need to be cognizant of all the social implications of whatever we are working on.
So, talk to me about different sectors. Do you feel like in certain sectors like banking or finance, for example, they have it in their blood because of the regulations that they've had to put up with for the last X amount of years? They're more on board with this kind of stuff than in other sectors?
Yes, that's definitely true. Like broadly, if we take highly regulated domains, right, this includes financial services or healthcare or human resources or hiring. There have been regulations, for example, in the United States, dating back to the Civil Rights Movement and Civil Rights Act of 1964 and so forth, where there are several regulations against different types of discrimination. Uh, and these industries, as you mentioned, they have kind of in their DNA, right? Like even before machine learning models, they were thoroughly vetting various rule-based models or other types of models for, say, whether it is credit card marketing or lending decisions and so forth. Uh, so that I think from these industries we see a lot of interest in not only say model monitoring but also explainability and bias or fairness. Uh, but if you look at these three areas like fairness, explainability, and model monitoring, I would say that the model monitoring is perhaps applicable to almost all, if not, I would say rather say to all machine learning uh, applications. The reason is that model monitoring is directly tied to, say, the business impact of the machine learning model. So even if a model is deployed in a non-regulated sector, let's say in energy or manufacturing, predictive maintenance, fraud detection, and so forth, if the model ends up degrading over time, that tends to hurt the bottom line of the company. So there is a direct connection and there is a direct reason as to why the organizations as well as the all the stakeholders should care about model monitoring. And perhaps the notions like fairness may be applicable only in settings where it involves humans, but notions like model monitoring are perhaps more broadly applicable.
Just to piggyback off that question a little bit, and maybe to throw in a little bit of a devil's advocate kind of an argument here. I think a lot of issues that many organizations struggle with nowadays is not even thinking about monitoring per se, just trying to get their first machine learning models into the wild, right? Getting their first machine learning wins. So one could argue that monitoring is a little bit of a secondary concern for a lot of organizations. To what extent is that true? And in particular, is there a role for things like explainability and even monitoring for companies that haven't even gotten those first machine learning wins?
That's a great point. I think if you think of this AI evolution of organizations, right? As you kind of mentioned, many organizations are at the stage where uh, they have to they haven't even deployed machine learning models, right? So I think that's the first step. So if you look at uh, the data science life cycle, right? Or I'm trying to remember the exact term. So this ladder of data science that Monica Roberti has put together.
Yeah,
So it's
the
not
AI
just
hierarchy of needs, right? The AI hierarchy of needs.
exactly the AI
Yeah.
hierarchy of needs or data science hierarchy of needs. Uh, the it's Organizations often may not even realize that we have to start with collecting the right set of data, right? Setting up the right pipelines, right ETL workflows, data cleaning, data validation. All those things are at least as important as, say, the machine learning part. Um, yeah, a few years back, there was a paper from Google highlighting, as perhaps many of the audience knows, highlighting that the machine learning uh, aspect is a very small aspect of this overall MLOps ecosystem, right? So the machine learning part may be the fanciest thing that data scientists or engineers may gravitate towards, but this rest of this ecosystem is at least as important. Um, but going back to your question, eh, the uh, can you just mention the question again? This is
Yeah,
about
yeah.
why should we
Mhm.
care about model monitoring, right? Before even deploying models.
That's right. Yeah. So I mean, one way to think about it is, that monitoring could potentially be viewed as a secondary concern because in that hierarchy, people haven't even gotten to their first deployments. But I'm wondering if there is that true, right? I mean, is there maybe a role even for thinking about things proactively in the sense of monitoring, even for those organizations that haven't gotten to.
So I'll give an example where what Mihail mentioned is very true, right? Like let's take banking or financial services as an example. Uh, so let's consider an organization which is using rule-based or interpretable models today for the lending decisions. If if we need to convince their compliance or legal team that you have to adopt machine learning models, I would argue that explainability and monitoring is part of that uh, aspect, right? Otherwise, if those are not present, the the legal or compliance teams may not be comfortable moving from the rule-based models that everyone understands to these opaque machine learning models. So from that angle, monitoring or explainability or perhaps necessary prerequisites for machine learning to be adopted. But that said, in many settings, in many sectors, we would likely see we would likely see the evolution that, say, tech companies went through. If you rewind back, say, 4 or 5 years back, companies started adopting machine learning models, but there was not as much emphasis on explainability or monitoring. I- So we are seeing a similar trend in other sectors. So what we expect is that maybe a few years down the road, model monitoring and explainability will get more traction and more interest as companies start using not just one or two machine learning models, but perhaps hundreds or thousands of models being deployed.
So one maybe related question to this is because of this growth in interest in machine learning monitoring and explainability, there's been a lot of new tools and companies that have come out on the market trying to address similar concerns. I wonder why you think that's the case, that we're seeing so much interest in a lot of these aspects, and whether or not you see that as a good thing or a bad thing, that we're seeing such a surge in organizations trying to address monitoring concerns.
I would say that it's a great thing, in the sense that that suggests that there is sufficient demand for such tools. The fact that it's not just Fiddler, but it's several other both large and small organizations, and even in academic settings, that people are thinking about these problems suggests that these are real problems. Right? I would be very nervous if we were a startup and we were the only one working in that space. Right? That perhaps may mean that there is not a good product market fit. The fact that there are several efforts to address this broader model performance management indicates that this is a real problem, and we will over the years we will see how this field evolves, right? And even this field, as we discussed earlier, is evolving a lot. The tools that may be relevant for say categorical or tabular models may not be as relevant for say large language models or in other say edge AI settings and so forth. So I think there may be a need for different flavors of tools that cater to the wide range of machine learning models and AI systems being deployed.
Well, you kind of touched on that. That's an interesting point. As you look forward, and if you had a crystal ball and we could transport ourselves 5 years in the future, what do you think explainability looks like in that scenario?
So that's always it's always challenging to anticipate what the future holds, right? But I think that y- uh, as machine learning becomes more broadly adopted in lots of day-to-day settings, right? Like I think there will be definitely aspects of uh, AI models interacting together with human systems. So more of, so you can think of them as human in the loop, or sometimes as called algorithm in the loop systems. So I think explainability will perhaps become a prerequisite so that the human experts who are leveraging the machine learning models understand how these models are working and then make the decisions accordingly. I think that would be one aspect I expect that this will evolve towards. If you look at settings where uh, partial or complete automation is proceeding, right? If, as in, say, automotive industries, like say in the whether it is autonomous driving or near autonomous driving, I think those may also be settings where i- articulating why the model is making certain decision may become important. And the challenge is, to what extent do we as humans want explanations of every decision made by opaque model versus how, to what extent are we comfortable developing trust in such models and relying on these models even if we don't understand how these models are behaving. I think that's a tough question, and I think it's this evolution will be shaped not only by the technical developments, but perhaps also by how we as society shape our views, right? The broader sociologists or other social scientists and non-technical stakeholders. I think we'll jointly perhaps see how this evolves, and to a good extent, I think the various regulations that are taking place both in the United States, Europe and other countries, I think that will also play a role in how this field evolves.
So there's something super interesting there around the non-technical stakeholders that are looking at or needing to have their voice within this space. And I like that you brought that up because I'm a firm believer in that too. I always wonder, and I guess that's what we said is 5 years from now, and you could wave a magic wand, where would you be going with it? I always wonder how that's going to happen, in 5 years or in however many months or years, how these different groups of people will play nicer together and if they can find a common language to speak in, per se. And the other thing that I'm wondering on this is where do you think we're blocked right now to get to that? Like, what are going to be some of the biggest challenges in order to hit that spot?
So I would say that so one place where we may be blocked is uh, it's important to get inputs from all the stakeholders, right? Especially those who are affected or impacted by the AI models as part of that design itself. I think that's perhaps happening in certain settings. Um, for to give an example, a few years back, while working at LinkedIn, we worked on models for fairness in ranking of candidates. So that was a setting where we realized that it's not a pure technical problem, right? It's a problem that's socio-technical. So we started with listening to LinkedIn's enterprise customers as well as LinkedIn's end users or LinkedIn's members, and using those inputs to shape our collective thinking. So I think this is such process has to happen in other domains as well, whether it is financial services or healthcare or kind of even in any domain, right? Autonomous driving and so on, any domain which has potential impact on society. I think the blocking today may be that the organizations may not be capturing the inputs of those impacted by the AI models as much. And more broadly, I think this may need to happen at multiple levels, not only at the leadership level, but also perhaps even at the machine learning developers, right? The engineers and scientists level. Uh, it's always a great idea to build empathy for the users of your product or service. In certain settings, it's possible to e- like drink your own champagne, right? Like experience your own product, but it may not be possible in all settings. But in those latter settings, I think it's very important as we all as machine learning developers and engineers, scientists to understand what our customers are going through, what our customers want, what are what are the design decisions that need to be influenced by their needs. How are they using the system as opposed to how we think they may be using? There are also broader aspects such as that's the reason why it's very important to ensure that there is diversity of demographics, diversity of perspectives, diversity of lived experiences in the teams, because that helps to a good extent get a pulse of how customers may use the system. That helps discover any blind spots beforehand to just make sure that the model works not only for one or two demographic groups, but perhaps for all demographic groups well, and for all types of customers well.
Just to, I think that's a fantastic point. And this is something that I think a lot about. I think we as machine learning practitioners often find it very easy to go into our corners, work on our code, build our models, and never really step back and think about the implications of what we're doing and the other people that might influence. On this point of understanding organizational context, understanding the implications of the things that we build, what concrete steps do you think or advice would you give machine learning practitioners to try and address some of these concerns, to try and be more empathetic to user concerns, to organizational concerns, to make sure that people come to the table and can kind of see eye to eye on these aspects?
Mhm. Um, so I think I can think of maybe a few suggestions. One is a lesson I learned a lot while I was part of AWS machine learning team leading the responsible AI efforts. It's that it's very important to listen to customers from the very beginning. Right? To listen to customers, to understand what are the pain points, to make sure that whatever we are building uh, helps address their pain points, right? And this includes all potential customers, not just say a subgroup of the customers. I think the second aspect might be to learn from several resources that are available today. Um, as a year back, with a few other uh, machine learning practitioners and researchers from organizations like Microsoft and Google, we presented tutorials on responsible AI from an industry perspective, right? What are the practical challenges? What are the lessons we learned from a few case studies? This is available online. So there are several such materials, right? Whether it's tutorials or case studies from which we can learn to some extent. Again, like those may not be applicable as is to the specific setting that somebody may be working on, but at least it'll give a feel for what are the questions to be asked. Often things start with asking the right questions. That's often missing if you think of this machine learning pipeline. It starts with asking when we start, or should we even be using a machine learning based approach for this problem? Is this even an ethical problem that we need to be solving using technical methods? Then, when we look at, say, data collection, it's important to understand uh, are we collecting data that represents potential users of the system? Do we have sufficient representation from different groups of users? Do we need to measure any biases? Do we need to remove biases in the data sets? So similar questions apply even during model training and validation. Are there, does, in addition to the model performing well overall, is the model having similar predictive behavior across all groups that we care about? When we do A/B testing of models, are there differences in performance for different types of users? Even if the model provides a lift overall, is it providing lift in performance only for some subgroups compared to others? And likewise, once the model is deployed, due to changes in real world conditions, is the model starting to degrade in performance? Is the model having feedback loops where it can potentially become biased or racist or exhibit other kinds of issues over time? I think these are all things that we need to think through, and it starts with realizing that these are issues to be aware of. And then there are several resources available online to learn from about these topics.
Dude, that list of questions, if it is not a blog post already, you should definitely make it into one. Just what questions should I ask myself before deploying or
It's
while I'm putting it out there?
it's fascinating actually that you bring those up, because I remember even there's been this trend even in conferences, like AI conferences. Like this was certainly true in the language conferences, where now there is actually a component where when you're submitting a paper, you have to answer a few questions about the ethical implications of your work. Was this data collected responsibly if you're using a data set or you built a data set? And so I think even in the community, we're starting to be more proactive about having people think
Actually,
about these things.
you know what's crazy about the data set piece, and I saw someone post this on some social network, and I can't exactly remember. I think it was this woman named Sasha Lucioni, and she just asked, can someone give me an example of an ethically sourced data set? And for her, when people said, oh, there's this data set or there's this data set, she would come back and say, did the people that created that data set, first of all, did they know that
Right.
they were creating a data set? And most of the time, they didn't. And so then, boom, that is one of these parts that's like, oh, so I guess that's not quite an ethical data set. And this whole post just showed how difficult it is to find ethically sourced data. And I wonder what your thoughts on that are, Krishna.
Yeah, so I think that's a great point. Often, um, even our notions of what is an ethically sourced data set have evolved over the last several years. If we look at the time when, say, web search was, there's a lot of interest in web search, uh, it, we started having data sets by crawling the web, right? There are different types of data sets obtained from web crawls. And from those data sets, we have perhaps extracted maybe images or biographies and so forth. So a natural question to ask is, did the people who are part of these data sets consent to their image or text or biography being used for training certain models? And so I think that's kind of the question that Demetrius is perhaps alluding to. So more concretely, if you look at, say, even applications like facial analysis or speech or anything cognition related applications. So often this is a huge challenge, how to obtain data set with consent of users, and also data set that represents a wide range of demographic groups or experiences, user groups, and so forth. So the challenge I recall with even facial analysis is that when some of the companies wanted to collect diverse set of data sets, it starts with even developing trust with specific communities. Even if the organization is willing to compensate people, it's not immediately obvious that people would be willing to share their biometric data or other kinds of data with the large organizations. I think there are several such I would say beyond technical, right, like socio-technical aspects that have to be addressed to develop such ethically sourced data sets. I think that's, I would say that this is still very much a work in progress, how to collect data sets with consent of users, how to make sure that these data sets represent all potential stakeholders, and how to ensure that these are free from different types of biases.
I think that's a really good point. And just to add one little small addendum, I think the other thing to consider is that for a lot of these data sets, when they're built, they tend to use crowdsourced labor, which is typically you have entire teams of individuals in underdeveloped countries that are being paid very small amounts of money, working long hours to get these data sets out. And that's something that we don't even really consider when we're using something like ImageNet or any of these other large-scale benchmark data sets that we know and love and have been so crucial to machine learning progress over the last decade plus.
Yes, I think that's very true. In fact, as you mentioned earlier, often in conferences, when there are user studies performed, as part of this ethical or social impact statement, one of the requirements is where the users compensated adequately, where they paid minimum wage in the respective regions. So I think as a community, we are starting to ask such questions. I think that's a step in the right direction. But there are again like broader challenges, right? Like as you mentioned, right? How to ensure that uh, the way the data set is collected is done in a very responsible manner.
I have a little bit of a different question. This is okay. So let's say that I'm a new organization, right? A new company that's listening to this podcast, is hearing everything you're saying, and says, Krishna, I totally agree. I think you're on point. Monitoring, explainable AI, these are things that we need to think about, and we as an organization want to emphasize these things. But it's a new organization, right? How do you think about, or what would you recommend to these organizations as their minimal explainable product? Like, how should they think about getting the best bang for their buck when it comes to just the small features around explainable AI or monitoring? What should they be thinking about?
So I would suggest that in that setting, right, when the organization is starting to train machine learning models and starting to adopt machine learning models in practice, um, it's helpful to start with even understanding which features are perhaps most important for the model prediction. That can help not only with, say, figuring out any issues with biases or maybe undesirable features and so forth. But it can also help the data scientists uh, determine how to improve their machine learning models. If they have to design more features, which features were perhaps more relevant or more attributable for the model prediction. Likewise, it can also help meet any complaints or regulatory needs. And similarly, with explainability, we can also figure out which parts of the model, which parts of the data set were most responsible for the model. And that can help understand even issues with the parts of the data. For instance, if there are mislabeled, some part of the data is mislabeled, often it can show up as negatively contributing to the model performance. So that's a way to even discover some issues with the data sets. And beyond, say, model validation, uh, I would suggest that it's a good idea to incorporate tools for model monitoring as well, so that they can be alerted when things go wrong. Instead of someone say retraining the models on a regular basis, or just checking the models once in a while, having tools for monitoring helps to detect the problems earlier than later. That can often translate into saved uh, profit or revenue, and that can more than compensate for the effort or the time, effort, and money involved in applying such techniques or tools for monitoring.
All right, man. So I want to ask a question that I feel like a lot of people have had to grapple with. And this is something that for me, I can see this as being a very hard moral question that you would have to go through. But you gave all these different questions that you should be asking before and while you're putting out some machine learning models into the wild. And you also have this juxtaposition with the fact that you are under deadlines and you have to get things done. You have to, or your company is counting on you to create business value. So how do you look at that push pull of I want to do everything nice, I want to make sure that things are ethical and they are explainable, and then the fact that like, hey, we're a small startup and we got to get something out there so that we can test this out and we can start making money, hopefully, or saving money or one of the sort. And it feels like there's just a little bit, they're at ends and they're at odds.
That's definitely a tension that uh, we see in practice, right? I think there are. I can provide a few different perspectives. One perspective is that often that choice or that kind of resolving the tension has to start with the leadership, right? If the leadership believes that, say, the ethical aspects, responsible AI, are at least as important as meeting near-term business metrics, then that would kind of propagate throughout the organization. That's if in the absence of that, I would say that between these three aspects, like model monitoring, explainability, and bias or fairness, the interest would be in this direction, because model monitoring directly ties in with the business metrics or revenue or profit. So a direct incentive for organizations to apply model monitoring. Explainability maybe a little bit less so in cases where it helps perhaps data scientists debug their model predictions or improve their models or meeting compliance needs. Bias and fairness, perhaps even less so, unless there is some forcing function, right, from maybe from a legal or regulatory setting, or from a social responsibility setting, or from this, as I mentioned earlier, from this external vetting, right, external auditing of the community. There may not be direct incentives to focus on that, but that said, it's not necessarily always attention. In many cases, by understanding about biases and biases of the models, you may be able to identify that there are some groups of users who are not getting the most benefit of the model. By improving the performance for those groups, let's say by collecting maybe better training data and so on, you can improve the performance of the model as a whole, and thereby even improve perhaps your business metrics, right? Revenue or profit or other metrics. So these are not necessarily at tension with each other, but sometimes, as you mentioned, they are at tension, and that's where the role of the leadership at the organization, right, or all of us as stakeholders comes in place.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's interesting to note also this idea that we were talking about, and hopefully it grows more and more around the community asking these questions, and hopefully the public or society demanding certain standards of products that they interact with. Maybe that's a pipe dream. Maybe we will see it in the next 5 years or 10. But this has been great, man. I really appreciate you coming on here and enlightening us to the explainability aspect, also getting various stakeholders involved. I love your idea around what are we hopefully going to see within the next 5 years, and also what questions should we be asking ourselves when we are going to put a product onto the market, or when we have a product onto the market, how can we make sure that we are doing the best that we possibly can with that machine learning product? So this has been great. I think we can end it here, and thank you so much.
Yeah, likewise. So it was my pleasure talking to both of you, and I think the questions that you are asking also makes me think further, right? I feel like I also learned a lot from this discussion. Thank you for hosting this podcast today.